Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our 21st weekly webinar since the onset of COVID-19. This week's webinar is all about masks, or as we've been calling it around the office, masks, 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 in which we will discuss everything you never wanted to know about masks but totally need to ask. We are delighted to have you with us for the next hour, and thank you for joining us today and for submitting your questions during the registration process and during the webinar. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit questions, and we will do our best to cover them all today. We also are planning a new closing for our webinar today, a fact or fiction lightning round, in which we will confirm some important facts and dispel some common myths about masks. So make sure you stick around for that part of our program today. So I'm Jackie Werns. I'm thrilled to be back here with you out of the Title IX trenches today. I've been gone for a while, but I'm very excited to be back with you today. And today on our panel, we are pleased to have Carrie Stacy, Director of Special Education for North Palos School District 117. Welcome, Carrie.
Thank you, Jackie. Hello, everyone.
So we know Carrie's been thinking a lot about masks, including developing a really useful chart that we're going to look at today to help some school teams navigate decisions about mask medical exemptions for students. I'm also joined by three of our regular panelists, Nikki Baser.
Hi, everyone.
Dana Fattori-Crumley.
Good afternoon, everybody.
And Jennifer Smith.
Hello.
So before we jump into our masks discussion, I want to highlight our topic for next week, which will be remote, hybrid, and in-person instruction, navigating teacher evaluation across settings. Keep an eye out for a registration announcement in the coming days and let us know any questions you have through the registration process or by emailing allmarketing@franczek.com. And as always, if you find yourself looking for more information or if we're not able to get to your question today, please reach out to one of us for information. And if you missed any of our webinars, you can find them all on our website at franczek.com, where you can also find out more information about our webinars, alerts, blogs, and podcasts on many, many topics. Okay, and with that, let's jump right into masks, masks, masks. So Carrie, let's start out with introducing you a bit more to our audience. Can you tell us a bit about your community, your district, and your schools?
Sure. So we serve the communities of Palos Hills, Hickory Hills, and a portion of Bridgeview. We are a 5-school district with just over 3,500 students. About 12% of our students have IEPs. We're also about 70% low income, and a third of our students receive EL services. And we have about 45 different languages spoken in our district. So we're very diverse, and we've grown and changed a lot over the last 10 years. In regards to special education, we have a full continuum of service from co-teaching supports in the general education classroom all the way down to a functional life skills and academic program. And we also belong to a co-op, the Southwest Co-op out of Oak Forest.
Awesome, thank you. And we're very excited again to have you with us here today.
Yes,
okay.
Thank you.
So let's spend a little bit of time orienting ourselves on the legal issues here, because before we talk to Carrie about the more practical aspects, we want to make sure we lay the legal groundwork. And obviously we received some new guidance on, including a lot of guidance on masks from IDPH just yesterday. So we will make sure to touch on some of that. But let's start out with perhaps one of the most frequent and pressing questions we've heard, which is, can districts mandate mask wearing for students? Dana, what are the legal limits for districts and schools on mandating the wearing of masks?
So we're going to turn to the headlines to answer this question, because I think that's the best way to respond. It'll stick with everybody. So just from a parent up in Wisconsin, our neighbor to the north, this is her response to that question. Can school districts mandate mask wearing? She says, 6-foot distance and wearing masks are pagan rituals of satanic worshipers. My kids are Christian and they are not subject to wearing masks. This is from Heidi Anderson, not related to Shelley Anderson of our firm, but up north in Wisconsin. Heidi, I'm going to respond to that question by quoting another person from the news, and this is my favorite tweet of the week, and it is from a New York Times reporter, and she was responding to the question, can school districts mandate what kids wear in school? And her response was, tank tops, bare shoulders, and half shirts. OMG, yes. So in this issue, the New York Times reporter does win out. She's not spreading fake news. School districts can mandate what kids wear to school. So just as we don't let kids wear things that are too revealing or that would disrupt instruction, here we have health and safety guidance telling us that people have to wear masks, and schools need to follow that guidance.
What about employees, Nikki? Can schools tell employees that they must wear masks?
I am muted. That was the first time that's happened to me. I apologize. Yes, and based on public health guidance, and certainly the guidance that we saw yesterday, school districts must mandate mask wearing of their employees while they're in the school building.
All right, now let's move on to something that is the source of a lot of concern, accommodations. So employees may be a little easier to discuss, so let's start there first. Can employees request accommodations in regard to the mask requirement? And if so, what do they need to provide to support such a request?
Yes, I mean, they certainly can request an accommodation. We recommend that a district have an accommodation request form that's specific to masks or to face coverings. And I know those of you who have received our protocols, we have one in our our face covering protocol. I should say, you know, the term masks is the one that we're using. I know that OSHA has a lot of strong feelings about masks versus face coverings, but we're going to just use masks because that's what we've been using here. So yes, I would have a form, the districts, and that form, the information on the form has to be verified by a physician. The district may also need at some point to seek their own independent medical determination about what a teacher is saying. I know we're going to talk about this in the context of students, but there don't seem to be a lot of reasons why a teacher should not be able to wear a mask in a school building. The latest ISB guidance, the FAQ, interestingly, indicates that a teacher who cannot wear a mask should wear a face shield and maintain social distancing. Given the previous guidance on face shields, specifically the CDC's recommendation against wearing face shields as a substitute for masks, I think this is going to make a lot of other staff and parents potentially pretty nervous if they start seeing teachers wearing face shields instead of masks. So I think, the advice is that certainly accommodations can be requested. They need to be reviewed and considered. The same interactive process needs to be employed, but any requests like this need to be reviewed very carefully. Like I said, there's probably not a lot of conditions that would prevent an adult from wearing a mask. And you're going to have to look at that very closely.
And so as far as a reasonable accommodation, and if there is a condition that would prevent someone from wearing a mask, what do they need in order to prove that? Can an employee's doctor just say that they can't wear a mask? Is that enough? Can they then come to work without one? Dana, what do you think about that one?
So I think we need to start with what does reasonable accommodation means. And I think most people that work in special ed law and even labor and employment law do have familiarity with this. Reasonable means just what it says, reasonable. It doesn't mean what the employee wants. So I'll give you a good example. We did have an employee whose physician said, you can't wear a mask and it's contraindicated and you can't wear a mask at all. And this was not a teaching employee, this was an office employee. So instead of delving into, and I do think one of the steps for someone that needs to be in the building during business hours is that request a valid request? And something written on a prescription pad is certainly not the same as something that the doctor has filled out regarding the specific problem and why the accommodation is needed. So I think that's sort of the first step. But I want to remind people that coming to work without wearing a mask may not be the accommodation you offered. In this case, which I thought was a very creative approach, it was an office employee The building closed at 3:30 where she worked. And the accommodation she was given was, if you need to not wear a mask, you can't be in the building when other people are in the building, come and work from 3:30 to 10. That's your accommodation. You can do your administrative office work just as well then as you can. Interestingly, sometimes with these cases, the employee all of a sudden shows up to work the next day, 8 to 3, with a mask on. But we were fully ready to, let her into the building to do the work that she needed to do at that time. So again, reasonable meets the need. It doesn't mean that it's exactly what that person wants.
What about for students? Jennifer, can they request an accommodation to the mask requirement, and how do they do that?
Yes, so students can request an accommodation, or parents on their behalf, by submitting, just like employees, submitting medical information, or if you have medical information based on historic evaluations that for some reason already address this issue, that's how they would request it. You still go through your 504 or IEP process to consider, just like Dana said, okay, that doesn't mean safety is not an issue. You have a doctor's note. And just like in other contexts where your school teams are used to getting doctor's notes that say all kinds of stuff, and we don't just say, oh, we have a doctor's note. Okay, we're going to do this. No, the requirement is you consider it. So the same thing, we're going to get information from a medical provider or have information from an evaluation and consider it through your IEP or 504 process. And we will come back to and talk about the new guidance yesterday, but that lays the groundwork for what we're going to do.
Okay, so now that we have some of the legal foundation under us, let's talk about how this works in practice. So Carrie, how has your district been handling requests from parents that their students cannot wear a mask to school?
So it's been pretty in line with what Jennifer said. We're holding IEP meetings, and the staff and myself, we've gone through the flow chart that we're going to share in a little bit and talk through what all of those things mean and what could a reasonable accommodation ultimately be. So we have those discussions with the parents. We haven't been in a situation yet where we've been able to share the copy with the parents. A lot of our meetings have been virtual and the parents are over the phone, but the conversations don't always go very well. But I think those have been our two biggest things. The misconception from parents is that if they get the exemption, they believe that their child is starting school. So some have felt very blindsided, I guess, when we're having the meeting and asking the questions, because they think the exemption is an automatic rather than it's a consideration. And I think that's been one of the biggest challenges for us.
It might help to ground the conversation a little bit. Can you say what your broad district plan for reopening is?
Sure. So we're having in K-5, we're having our students back every day with a 45-minute late start. We're able to do that because 70% of our families elected in person. So we have the space for that. Our middle school, because we have one middle school in the large numbers, middle school students attend a half day every day. So they're on kind of a rotating schedule. So when we're meeting with parents, we're really looking at a very long school day for some of these students. And when you start talking the practicality of the student's going to have a mask on for 6 hours, it's really seems like the first time the parents really have had to realize like what that could be like for their child.
I think that's important to consider. There's so many different plans out there, and this isn't and people are considering masks in a multitude of contexts, or maybe you're remote, but you're planning to eventually be in person. So you're still in the planning phase. I just really appreciate you being here, and Carrie, because you've already kind of gone through some of this with your parents and with your planning. So I also wanted to share with people, you have such a heart for your parents and your families and what they're experiencing, and wanting to give them the best, as much as you possibly can. And so I'm sure that will come across even during this, but it's just been a pleasure to work with you. And I know you're doing right by your families, even though these conversations have been really, really hard.
I appreciate all of your support and your quick responses because I'm reaching out often, for sure.
Yeah, and we know so many of our clients and friends are having these really hard discussions for both the teams and the parents because they are very legally complex and emotionally charged. And Carrie, you mentioned the chart that you created to guide this process in your district. So I am going to share this chart, assuming I can do this technology. All right, if my panelists can confirm for me, are you able to see the chart? Great. Okay, so Carrie, I've got it zoomed out here right now, but I'm going to zoom it in a little further so that you can hopefully walk us through.
So when we were trying to kind of wrap our heads around how do we have these conversations with families and how do we do it objectively, essentially thought of it as kind of a flow chart or a hierarchy in which you start at the top when there's limited or minimal concerns and work your way down and how that may be an implication in the classroom. So you may have a student that can wear a mask and tolerate a mask with minimal concern and is able to maintain social distancing with or without supports, because we know if we can provide visual schedules, visual pictures, reminders, and a student may take his mask off but put it right back on, that's not a reason for, that's not an unsafe situation. I think the key that we went back and forth to with the masks is always the word and that social distancing piece, because if you're working with a student and they take their mask off, if you can socially distance and work with them to put it back on, that's a safer situation. So if the student meets that first requirement, then there really aren't any limitations to them attending in person. And then in conversations with the family, you ask about, you know, under normal conditions, the grocery store, the zoo, or wherever they might go, will the child keep the mask on for 20 to 30 minutes? And if so, and then they have a break, will they put it back on? Because some of our students may wear it for 20 minutes, but then they won't wear it again the rest of the day. They're kind of maxed out. So I think that piece of taking the break, but then putting it back on for another duration of time is really important when you're thinking about the length of the school day. And if a student is able to do this, they could be considered for a full day of school, because those mask breaks, especially in a more contained special education environment, could be controlled safely. I think when you move further down to a student maybe tolerating a mask for 10 to 15 minutes and is able to socially distance, when you look at that across a 6-hour day, that's a lot of prompting, a lot of redirection. And as the day goes on, the child is going to be less and less tolerant and could ultimately turn the experience very negative. And the quality of their instruction will likely be compromised. So that's when we started talking about maybe there's the school day length is the modification or the accommodation that needs to happen. Maybe we need to start with less time in the school building and work on stamina and work on supports. And as they could move back up the flow chart, we can potentially lengthen their school day. I think where the conversation gets really difficult for parents and in our experience is kind of those last two boxes. So Jackie, if you could go down just a little bit, is when the child will only wear the mask for about 5 minutes or won't even tolerate it for 5 seconds. That's where it gets a lot harder to work through that reasonableness of being in person, because the student will be prompted repeatedly to put the mask on, put the mask on, put the mask on, and could ultimately become a very negative experience in which the child may then refuse to wear the mask at all. So this is where we would get into the considerations for in-person instruction on a limited basis, or beginning the year on remote instruction, and really working with the family to build the child's tolerance and stamina to wear a mask through virtual supports, to then work our way back up the chart. One of the thoughts that we had around a limited basis could be, once perhaps the OT or the speech path has done a session and has observed a student virtually being able to tolerate their mask, perhaps the parent could bring them and we can do an outdoor speech session and see how the student does. Or maybe we can then provide a couple therapy sessions, 10 to 15 minutes, in the school building, because the child will keep the mask on, and we can slowly extend that and find ways to work with parents to build back up to lengthening the school day and providing more in person. The box on the far right, the additional considerations, is really looking at all those other things that could make anything on this chart a little bit more complex. Medical condition, perhaps the student is medically fragile, has had previous surgeries, has respiratory conditions or heart conditions, that maybe even if they can wear a mask and socially distance, are they still safe? The ability to control their secretions, the bodily functions, sneezing and coughing. If they're not able to wear a mask for 5 to 10 minutes and socially distance and do these things, can we safely service them and provide quality instruction for them? Students engaging in behavior that spreads respiratory droplets. So students that maybe tend to spit or bite when they get angry, or kind of engage in those behaviors that even with a mask on, that they would be able to remove and still engage in those behaviors and not maintain that socially distance. The tolerance of the face shield and mask, I know we talked about that today, that's from the original guidance, but ultimately the face shield doesn't really provide that protection. So talking through when could it be appropriate, but is not really, could that work in place of a mask? And then really the way we discussed it with our IEP team is it almost comes down to almost like a placement conversation, and where you have this dialogue and you have this conversation, and can we reasonably accommodate following the guidelines based on the student's circumstances and maintain that safety? And I think what we're finding in a lot of cases is as we talk through these things, we're really not able to. But ultimately, we want to try to consider everything openly and willingly.
Carrie, you know what I just think is so remarkable about this flow chart is two things really. First, that your approach is so child-centric, which I just think is critical. I mean, it's not just all kids in one bucket, right? It's really drilling down on the specifics of the individual student. I think the second point that I would just raise, and it's something that I think all administrators on this webinar likely know, is that every area of these guidance documents that ISB and IDPH are putting out, so they say everybody has to wear a mask, like the complexity of just that statement when you actually drill down, given the needs of individual students, I mean, it's so complex, and you've done a really nice job sort of laying out in some level of order how to approach this, but it is a really complicated process. But again, I just think the fact that it's so child-centric and how you're looking at this is so critical.
And I think for teams that don't even know where to start with, how do we make this decision for someone? I don't know, and so I think you really helped your team. Here's a way you can go through the steps, and it does take ISB's guidance and everything we know about considerations of when something would be appropriate. And you're not saying this will happen. I mean, at every box, it's just a consideration, but it does gently move you through. I mean, it says consider, but you kind of know it's very logical in what the outcome would be in different scenarios, and it encompasses all the different factors that you're going to consider. So just really well done. I mean, we asked you if you wouldn't mind sharing it, because we thought, wow, other people were, I wish I had come up with this. This is really helpful to people out there. So I just really appreciate your willingness to share your work and share with the community. That's really great.
Well, I hope that it's helpful. I know for our staff, there have been some very emotional meetings, parents crying, teachers crying, but having this objective piece to go to kind of keeps the meeting grounded, because your feelings get the best of you sometimes and you want to make concessions and you feel for the families and the parents, but it helps to keep something that's very emotional also very objective. And I think that's what's helped us get through these difficult meetings that we've had this week.
I love too how this really highlights what you said earlier, Carrie, which is that you know, it's not just a question of can a student wear a mask or not, that there's a lot of complexity to this, and you've really broken down that complexity in a very workable manner here. We had a question as to whether or not we would be providing this, and I do think we're going to be sending it out with our follow-up email, assuming Carrie's okay with that. So it'll be in the follow-up email that participants receive. So keep your eyes out for that. Now, Carrie, what are some of the reasons that you've heard from parents for why their students can't wear a mask? Are there particular groups of students, considering special education eligibility, that are requesting mask accommodations more frequently?
I think what we've seen, we've only had actually a couple formal mask exemption forms, but we've been essentially having these conversations with most of our families that have students with more complex needs. Definitely our students with autism that have more sensory sensitivities and also have the significant cognitive difficulties to even comprehend why they have to wear it. So it's just a very tactile, defensive thing for them. I think some of our students also with Down syndrome, or perhaps, you know, I think it really comes down to intellectual functioning. The more compromised the child is in that area, the harder it is for them to understand, even through the modeling and imitating, that they need to wear a mask. What I have seen that's been great is that I can give you a hopeful story, which we were all excited about. One of our students, the mom told us in the meeting that she won't even put the mask to her face. And the occupational therapist made a recommendation that she wear the mask in her hammock swing. And the next morning we got a video of the student in her hammock swing with the mask on for over 2 minutes. And I think that just says we have to acknowledge where we're at, but work through the parents with the emotions and then team with them, because I think we can get our kids there. I don't know how quickly, and maybe it won't be for a whole day. But I think that's the other important message that the parents need, is that commitment to, we're gonna support you, and that's gonna be our main goal of remote learning, because they've all said it doesn't work for my child. So there's this desperate sense that if they stay on remote learning, they're not going to learn. So our goal has to shift to getting them to wear a mask to get them back to school.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really one of the most positive things I've heard from teams. So I commend you and your team, because I think the key thing in special education is you have to try. You know, Rome was not built in a day. We don't learn how to speak another language in, 3 lessons. All of these things are hard, and they're especially hard for people with disabilities, but that doesn't mean that it's impossible. And I think that example shows that, like, what you're judged on in the law, and I think, Jennifer and I have talked, is, do you put that effort out there? It's your effort, it's not the result. We want to see kids making progress, but if it's not possible in all cases. Some people are very profoundly disabled and they're not, but it's the effort, it's the trying, it's the plan. That's how you're going to be judged from a legal perspective. And that's what the key thing is. So absolutely amazing effort by your team and by you.
Well, and we've talked about too that this is a new area, so it opens up. The goal of special education is also to broaden students' world, and I can't think of a better thing to work on, whether it be now you have access to stores in your community, now you have access to maybe see a relative that can only be around someone with a mask. I mean, this is truly a life skill that we're not just putting time into checking some box. This is an important part of functioning in our society right now. So there's no time wasted at all in making these small efforts, even if it results to only a small time and they can't get to school, but now they can get ice cream, or, it's still helping educating the student. You're doing exactly what you're supposed to be doing.
Such a great point. So, Carrie, has your team thought through what happens if you need to work remotely with students who can't wear masks? Has your team proposed any ideas about how to do that?
So after our first couple of meetings, we started brainstorming. Like I mentioned before, we're part of the cooperative. So we've reached out to them to kind of really secure the BCBA support. And that's one of the things that we shared to parents, is that we'd like to bring that member to the team to help us develop kind of systems and structures for the parents at home. We have also talked about ways that we can maybe create spaces in our schools to have almost like mask training clinics, if you would call it, where the parent could potentially bring the students in for a short session, and the parent can help with the social distancing piece, but the OTs and the speech paths and the BCBAs can be present to help kind of guide and simulate what a classroom experience would be like, so we can see how the students respond, maybe what visuals that we need to use. Sending parents, printing, laminating, creating those schedules, mailing it to them. For some of our parents that said, I don't know how my student's going to do. I've never made them wear a mask. I don't know if they'll be able to, you know, I want them to come to school and find out. And then if she can't, I'll come pick her up. That's kind of risky. So I talked to a team of teachers yesterday, actually following a meeting, and we said, well, let's invite the parents in next week before any kids are in the building. And let's just do some mock school and see how they do, because we'll get a better sense of if we can bring them back for part of the day based on how they respond to our cues. So I think we're still just really thinking through how to support the students the best we can. Maybe it's weekly sessions with the BCBA and they're following up. And I think we'll come up with more ideas, and some will work and some will not. But I think it's just supporting the family without pushing, this many hours of instruction and this many hours of your kid being on the computer for virtual therapy. Like, let's find what works and what's going to help you get your child ready to come back. And I think that's really shifting our thinking and planning for remote instruction.
When you're thinking about all of these complex decisions, are there any team members with particular expertise that you feel are critical for these meetings?
I definitely think that the BCBA, because I think that that very tailored and systematic approach with the reinforcement to wearing the mask and the parents having the ability to be coached by the BCBA is going to be critical, and your occupational therapist for sure, because of the sensory pieces and being able to pair maybe some preferred sensory movements, the vestibular movement, with wearing the mask could lead to greater success sooner.
So one question we received from a participant, let's go on to those. So what about students who experience anxiety or have emotional needs? So as one questioner explained, some schools are receiving notes from psychologists that masks make certain children anxious. So thinking about that in terms of accommodations for students based on developmental disabilities, Jennifer, what about those students? What are the things we need to think about there?
So I think we're going to go through a similar process where we're going to look at, okay, either your 504 team or your IEP team, whoever's supporting the student would consider is it they need support? Is they need some training? Is they need a shortened day? They need a space. They need breaks, if they're feeling anxious, they need to be able to go to a separate space. What accommodations can we address or can we provide to address that anxiety so that they can still wear the mask, but we're not ignoring the need that's been presented.
Right.
So I think it's going to be a very similar kind of discussion, but the types of solutions might be a little different than we were just talking about.
Exactly. And I think that when you think about the staff members that are going to help with that, like Carrie was talking about using the board certified behavior analyst who really works with kids with developmental delays and things like that to get them, learning a new skill. This is going to be the same sort of thing. I think it's going to be cognitive therapy to overcome this anxiety, but you're going to use a psychologist and you're going to rely on your school psychologist and your school social worker, which is a little bit of a tongue twister there, to really come up with some plans to sort of get the student to move beyond the anxiety, because we have anxiety to lots of things. And this is I love this because this is one of those things that can be addressed. People are afraid of heights. They're no longer afraid of heights. People are afraid of our favorite snakes. You can be desensitized to some of these fears, especially fears that you know, I love this question because you're actually probably safer wearing a mask. Not wearing a mask is probably more anxiety inducing to the general public than, you know, wearing one. So I think it falls into that category, and the school psych and the school social worker can really be resources.
All right, so we had new guidance yesterday from IDPH and received that from ISB regarding students who can't wear masks in schools. So I know we want to touch on that. And so I'm going to read to you from what the guidance says. It says that students with an IEP or 504 plan who are unable to wear a face covering or face shield due to a medical contraindication may not be denied access to an in-person education if the school is offering in-person education to other students. Staff working with such students due to a medical contraindication should wear approved and appropriate PPE based on job-specific duties and risks, and should maintain social distancing as much as possible. Other students also should remain socially distant from students who can't wear a face covering or face shield. Schools should consult with their local public health department regarding appropriate PPE for this situation. There is so much there. So Jennifer, let's break that down. What are your thoughts on this newest piece of guidance?
So first of all, we happened to be doing a prep call when we got this guidance, and we were all together and very, very frustrated. I just think that it doesn't address, first of all, it doesn't contemplate the actual requirements of 504 and IEP, how we consider student needs and address them and work through different options. We were never saying that districts should automatically, you can't wear a mask so you can't come to school. That was never our guidance, and that continues to not be our guidance, and that's how I'm reading what they're saying. Now, is it a factor? You know, is it going to trigger a discussion about other accommodations? Yes, I still think that that process that Carrie was talking about, or that we've been recommending regarding, okay, now we know this is one factor, and we're going to look at, are there other ways that the student could still be in person and safely receive instruction effectively? I mean, I thought the point that Carrie made often gets lost. At some point, we're no longer providing instruction, you know? So if you can't be around other kids, so if the student's alone in a room with someone, I mean, when it says appropriate PPE, I don't know if we're just doing a hospital placement at that point and the in-person is in a hospital, because if the student, let's say, needs physical restraint or management and is the kind that will pull it off. Well, I'm not aware of the appropriate PPE that, you know, is going to address those situations, which are real situations. So I guess how I am limiting my interpretation to this to say, yes, it is true that we are never going to say just because you can't wear a mask, you cannot have in-person instruction. That is not the analysis, and that would be only one factor in the start of a discussion that is much more complicated than that. I don't know if anyone else wants to add, because there's really a lot there.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is just a vast, I think one of the hardest thing about counseling in this area and grasping it and putting it into practice for school administrators is it is a process and an analysis. It's not like a yes or no, black or white answer. And everybody in today's society wants a yes or no, black and white answer, especially in everything in regard to coronavirus. And we should all know after 5 months that that's just not, it would be great. It's like in our fantasy world, but we're not going to get that. So we're not going to get that, and we need to move on. And that takes me back to the chart. The chart follows the law and what you're supposed to do. And you're weighing what the possible, again, you're looking at the needs and you're weighing all the possible accommodations. And just because a person can't come into the building doesn't mean that they may not be accommodated. They could be getting one-to-one service remotely that was well in excess of everything everyone else was getting remotely that might be able to make up for the time. And so we can't shut that out. It might not, but we can't shut out those other possibilities. It really requires us to be creative thinkers and to think of everything that is at our disposal and maybe some things that aren't. The biggest concern I have about this is I'm fearful that you're going to have parents use it who as a basis for kids that really don't need the accommodation. They just politically, for whatever reason, don't believe. And then we're going to have the situation of how do we handle this? How do we put kids that seem to be able to wear a mask, not wearing a mask, in a regular ed classroom with other kids wearing masks? And what will that do to our teachers? What will that, but more importantly for this discussion, because we don't want to get into labor law right now, what does that do to the rest of the population? You know, I do think that public education is largely dependent on having a community perspective, not a me perspective. And that perspective is completely lost in this guidance.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, and maybe this is sort of unfiltered frustration at this point, but I do think what's so troubling about guidance like this that is sort of so black and white and not nuanced in the way that everybody here is talking about is that, you know, we know, Carrie, is districts that are trying to reopen in some form are, you know, the districts are sort of falling fast and furious on this. And part of it, you know, rightly or wrongly, is that, you know, teachers are nervous and they're upset and they are concerned about safety. And again, rightly that they're concerned. Whether or not those fears are founded, you know, is a much more complicated question. But when you see something like this, I could see this again, sort of, you know, unions, teachers raising, you know, okay, well, I'm a special ed teacher, and that means that I'm going to be in a classroom with a bunch of kids without masks, and that's going to be very unsafe. And so I do think that as districts are trying to navigate opening and keeping everybody safe, staff and students, as, you know, Dana mentioned, sort of the community-based approach, this kind of guidance, I think, just keeps setting us back. And I'm not suggesting that the guidance is right or wrong, but it's so black and white about, well, you can't deny them. You know, I'm just nervous about what this does for those districts that are really, you know, trying to reopen in a way that's responsible to their communities. I know that was not helpful to anybody, but I just felt it needed to be expressed.
Do you mind if I just add a thought?
Yes.
Only because I think I talked about this with you, Jennifer, but I had mentioned before that we're a member of the co-op. And the co-op that serves students in the same population that we're speaking of, all of the co-ops are starting remotely for all of the reasons that we're discussing right now. So because we are a district that chooses to keep this population in their home school, but are also choosing to reopen for the community, it puts us in a very bad situation because we don't have the ability to say, like the co-op does, that, you know, based on the needs of our population, we have to start remotely. Because we are servicing so many different populations, has kind of forced us into this weird box where we have to have these conversations. So I think maybe that's how some other school districts are feeling as well.
Right.
It's a hard thing for parents to understand also.
But it also has that, I think what you highlight is it has the practical effect of leading to more closure, because it just is another barrier to overcome in keeping the school open. So it's difficult.
Yeah, this is all very, very challenging. So another question that we had received about sort of the challenges and how you make this work is, how do school leaders address the delay from the time that a parent makes a request or a statement that their child can't wear a mask through the time that you actually might get the doctor's notice? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think you have to have the doctor's note and the verification. You have to understand it. So I do think that that student needs to go remote before, a final determination while that request is being processed. You know, hopefully our parents are getting those requests in with doctor's verifications in advance of the school year starting. So folks like Carrie and her teams can look at them and actually spend the time. And I know there's a lot of meetings taking place, as she's referenced. But I think if you have a parent show up on the first day of school with a doctor's note, Then you place the kid on remote learning for the time being while that's processed and while the team meets, and then you can make the final determination.
Now, what about, we've mentioned a few times the fact that we do have some staff members, and particularly teachers, with discomforts, and one of the discomforts that has been expressed is discomfort with teaching students who don't wear masks. So Dana, any thoughts on how schools should handle requests from those teachers about that discomfort?
So we're going to get this in two ways. I mean, I think as far as individual teachers coming and saying, I'm uncomfortable, you know, we empathize, but uncomfortable is not going to be enough to get an ADA accommodation. Again, this is going to be an ADA accommodation that's going to fit into that category. And what you're going to require is a doctor's note, but the doctor should write the note, you know, based on the conditions that the teacher is facing. And if the teacher is facing coming to school with kids that won't be wearing masks, then I think the doctor has to have that information in order to advise his patient or her patient. I think the other way it's going to come to you, and we can probably get into this in a whole nother webinar, which I'm sure we will address at some point, is it changes the impact of having kids in the classroom with no masks is going to impact working conditions. And that's going to make it a subject of bargaining. And, you know, someone had mentioned, I don't know if it was Nikki, just sort of the inequity about, you know, special ed teachers and regular ed teachers. And it's going to highlight that inequity, and you're going to have to address it somehow. And it is going to be through PPE and what PPE you can get. And that's a whole nother, I know, challenge, because I've heard from clients that can't get the type of PPE that is recommended in this new guidance that was issued yesterday. So that's another area of concern.
Yeah, that's going to be a big issue. So before we get to our fact or fiction lightning round, we actually have a lot of questions that came in through the Q&A. So we might have a little lightning round here to try to get through some of these questions. So let's jump right into those. So a couple of questions we received asked about whether staff members are allowed to remove their masks in the school building if they are alone in a space such as a classroom. Dana, I think you had raised your hand on that. What do you think?
So I do not want to raise my hand on that. Can I back out at this point? But no, I understand that I can't. So I will proceed. I would have answered that question differently yesterday than I do today. I think most of us would. So the new ISB guidance, and I as an English teacher frown upon underlining in text. It is, you should use your language to make your point, not underlining, but it is underlined in the ISB guidance on page 5, and again, I'll point out that there's no page numbers here, which is again an English teacher problem, but is on page 5 that all school people, all staff, all persons on school grounds must wear a face covering at all times when in school or in transit to and from school via group conveyance. And at all times is underlined. So until we get guidance on this, I think this is the answer. And I would encourage people to ask for guidance and to sort of ask for clarification here, because I'm not sure how this is going to be feasible if we have people teaching on Zoom from classrooms.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Dana. And just to be clear, they indicate that there are certain exemptions, but no exemption that would apply to a teacher or teaching alone in a classroom. The exemptions are eating, outdoor situations if social distancing, playing musical instruments when there's social distancing, if using face shields for certain circumstances. And so I do think that this seems to shut down this possibility, and it is incredibly frustrating because I know a lot of districts are really working hard, even if their kids are remote, to have their teachers in the building. And yeah, I mean, I think this is something that we really need clarity on from ISB.
And I do think the way to phrase the question for ISB, and I do think about this in terms of certain classes. The community, meaning the whole state of Illinois, has spent millions, if not billions of tax dollars on state-of-the-art science labs, manipulatives for special ed students, I mean, all kinds of things that we are now saying, you know, unless you wear a mask, and we had our masks on at the beginning of this, and we took them off so that you could hear us better. So I do think this is sort of one of those things that we need some further clarification on.
Right. I think the point you're making, Dana, is that like you would want a science teacher, for example, like a chemistry teacher, to be in a classroom so he or she could demonstrate a lesson and do it in the lab, right? And so that would be, or an art teacher with all the supplies. And if those folks are having to have masks on, that becomes very difficult for students to engage with and also to understand, to hear. And so we really do need to drill down to be clear that this is actually what ISB meant.
And I'm not sure I mean, it makes no sense. You're going to take your mask off to play an instrument, but if you're alone in a science lab, you can't take it off so that the Zoom instruction is clear. I really wouldn't. This is guidance. It's not vetted the way laws and regulations are. So I don't think we want to take it to unreasonable interpretations.
Right. I think that when you look at the overall guidance on COVID, and you look at the social distancing and you talk about, I mean, and the fact of the matter is that people have been doing this. People alone in their offices, alone in their classrooms, have been without masks now since the beginning of this whole pandemic and since the beginning of our closing of schools. So again, it highlights, you know, to give some empathy here to people who are working at ISB, it highlights how difficult it is to write like an easy to understand document without going through every single possible scenario. But that's sort of what you need. You know, you can't write this. I think that one of the common complaints I've heard is that these guidance documents are written with nobody in the room that maybe has taught kindergarten, or nobody that has been around teenagers, or nobody, and that highlights the importance of context. So we'll try to get more info.
Well, also, as one of our commenters indicated, you know, this does create some practical risks for institutions, because one of our questioners said, you know, they had some concern that someone might see someone in a classroom without a mask and sort of report them in an effort to get school shut down to further a goal of, you know, having no in-person learning. So it even though this is only guidance, I think it is creating a lot of trepidation on the part of the folks who are having to implement it, because they don't want it to be used against them, which I think is a big concern.
Absolutely.
So I've lost my question box. There it is. So we had a question, and I know I saw some news reports about recent studies on neck gaiters and bandanas. Are neck gaiters and bandanas permitted to be used as face coverings in place of a mask?
So all I know is what we got yesterday. I've also seen those reports. And basically what IDPH has put out here in this FAQ is that they've indicated that CDC does not recommend the use of athletic coverings, neck warmers, those kinds of things. They're recommending those are not substitutions for cloth face coverings. So I would go with that and recommend cloth face coverings. I know a lot of districts have extras on hand. So, you know, my assumption is that if someone shows up with a neck warmer, you will ask that student to don one of the cloth face coverings that the district has, and then remind parents that it's really a cloth face covering that they need to be using.
Yeah, I really burst my husband's bubble yesterday when he came home with a new neck gaiter, and I said, "You clearly haven't been watching the news."
Yeah.
What about EC students? Staff often have to remove a child from the car as they're sobbing for school. Masks may not be tolerated or become wet. How do we protect them? I'm going to couple that with another question, which is related, which is if staff and administration are assigned to take temperatures at the door as students enter the building, do they need to have a gown and gloves and eye protection, or do they just need to wear a mask? I think both of these questions are getting at some that we've been receiving of what kind of protection do we need to be offering for our staff when they're dealing with these different situations?
Well, I mean, on the entry to school and getting out of the car, I mean, just like the mask is a trigger, I think requiring physical intervention might be a trigger for a discussion about whether the student is able to safely do in person. And so maybe we used to, I mean, this is something we used to obviously accommodate, is that we would hold children from cars. That might not be something that we can do anymore because it's not safe. So it's going to be a new, and just like we were talking about on the face coverings, you know, could we do a process to teach students that you have to get out of the car, you know, or yes, I mean, and are we going to see some school avoidance or other issues, you know, and it's going to result in some students not being able to access in person? Yes, is the bottom line there as well. But I think we don't do some of those things anymore is the answer.
Yeah, and in terms of kids coming in the building, in terms of taking temperatures and the like, you know, we just got some recent guidance. In the recent guidance, they do talk about school nurses who are assessing staff or students with symptoms and go through very specific what the PPE looks like. In terms of the temperature taking, I think there's some various guidance out there in terms of what you actually need to provide. And so, you know, in those circumstances, I would actually recommend that you talk to the local public health officials about what they are recommending in terms of those staff members who, if you are doing certifications at the door rather than having parents self-certify, if you're taking temperatures, do they need, you know, extra PPE at that point? Do they need gloves? Do they need a face shield as well as a mask? Again, you know, I've seen conflicting guidance on this, so I think it is worth talking to your local health officials if you are doing temperature taking, you know, at the school building.
And I would say that that's a really good recommendation in light of a lot of the questions that we received. I can tell from the questions we're getting that people are feeling uncertain and nervous about things like, you know, why are N95 masks being required at all? What are we supposed to do with them? Are we supposed to sterilize them? Are we supposed to provide them? So I think, you know, that Nikki's point is a good one, that we are going to need to be pulling on those resources of the local health departments to get additional guidance on what is expected. What about, we had a question of, can you address what to do for students that do not have a 504 or IEP? We had a couple of questions on this. How do you proceed? Do you just take a doctor's note? Do you hold a meeting to consider whether they're eligible? Jennifer, do you have thoughts on that?
I do. I think we should hold 504 eligibility meetings with the doctor's note, because it is, the problem with not doing that is if there's a dispute and you say no, you're in a no man's land of, they probably do qualify. You have a doctor saying that they have a condition that impacts a major life activity. That's what the note equates to. So they should be eligible for 504, and then you're making a decision about the reasonable accommodation. Again, 504 has a very specific dispute resolution process, and you're much better off to clearly be in that, having that apply, than trying to say this is some other third thing, not IEP, not 504, and we don't even know, just file a grievance under the uniform grievance procedure. That would not be a good idea. So do a 504.
And 504 allows you to do your own evaluation. So if you think a doctor's note is not valid for some reason, you can open up an evaluation, and that evaluation can basically be what you want it to be. So that gives you a lot more flexibility. And I do think we need to have some structure, or you're just going to get requests that are not valid. If it's a valid request, they're going to go to the doctor, and, you know, it's not too much to ask.
All right, with our last couple of minutes, let's do our fact and fiction really quickly. So first of all, fact or fiction, teachers can be in their classrooms alone without a mask. We said this one.
That is fiction. They cannot be in their classroom without a mask based on the ISB guidance. But I would have answered it the other way had I not read that guidance. So there.
And maybe we want to give it a little bit more of a common sense reading, as Jennifer suggested too.
Or,
all right,
yeah.
fact or fiction, two teachers can be in the same large classroom working together without masks.
I think we're going to go with fiction on that one for now. Again, if we're concerned about one teacher, we're certainly concerned about two.
All right, fact or fiction, you can share with all parents the names of students in their child's classroom who are not wearing masks due to a medical exemption.
Fiction. Can't do
Fiction. A teacher, fact or fiction, a teacher can wear a Biden 2020 mask or a Make America Great Again mask to school.
Fiction. So we'll wrap this up with this. I know you know teachers are not allowed to wear political shirts, political buttons to school. There's a specific Illinois state law. You should definitely be looking at your dress code policies. Really, teachers should be wearing plain masks, or at the very most, if you have spirit wear masks, but they should not be coming to school with masks with other writing on them, particularly not political writing.
All right, our last comment I want to share from our Q&A is just a comment to Carrie that this flow chart is amazing. Thank you for sharing this model and process of offering a student-centered process for consideration of in-person learning. Carrie, thank you so much for coming and joining us today. It was such a pleasure to have you.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you to all of our panelists and to all of you for joining us. We will see you again in a week to talk about evaluations. So join us then, and until then, take care. Bye, everyone.